if I can. Okay, so the first point I want to make is that the Victory Garden depends on particular ideas. There are ideas that support the Victory Garden, ideas in terms of how we relate to the landscape. You'll notice that a Victory Garden, there's a certain knowledge that's applied to the landscape to achieve a goal. The goal is to produce food, and that goal is one way of relating to the land. It's not the only way, but unless we sort of examine these ideas, it's often just a taken for granted conventional wisdom that John Kenneth Galbraith talked about almost 70 years ago. He pointed out that first requirement for an understanding of contemporary economic and social life is a clear view of the relationship between events and the ideas that interpret them. And so in this lecture, I want to focus specifically on the kind of ideas that inform the way we relate to landscapes that have then implications for poverty and hunger. But also, another point to keep in mind as I'm talking is, where did the SDGs come from? What were the ideas that made it seem like a good idea to formulate these sustainable development goals? And so this is also a book that's been around for a long time, William Cronin's Changes in the Land. And so I think, when we start to think about applying different ideas to a landscape, the classic example is the invasion of Turtle Island by Europeans, and the impact that had on the biological diversity, on the affordances to feed people, the productivity of the land. This is the kind of landscape that the Europeans would have encountered when they invaded North America. This is an American chestnut on the eastern seaboard of the United States. You can see in the back there some sunlight coming through. These landscapes were managed by indigenous people to provide them with all of the resources that they needed to carry on their cultural way of life. So there were an abundance of berries. There was game. There were fish in the rivers that the Europeans couldn't believe. Right? This landscape clearly is very ecologically productive. Right? It has healthy soil. It has healthy plants. It's a healthy ecosystem. And as this Sachem points out, the English, having gotten our land, they with scythes cut down the grass and with axes fell the trees. Their cows and horses eat the grass, and their hogs spoil our clam banks, and we shall all be starved. This was the reaction of the indigenous people to the behaviors of the Europeans when they arrived. They recognized that the Europeans were not just extracting the maximum resources from the land. They were destroying the productivity of the land, right? And this is a point that even today I think is lost in many university programs. There's that idea of our relationship with the land is to extract as much as we can, rather than to protect the productivity of the land. Right, so if you look at the first goal is no poverty, and the way it's framed is a bit interesting, I find. The first target or indicator talks about putting a number there. $1.25 per day would be the how you would define poverty. and the goal is to get everybody above that quantitative metric. The next one is more nuanced, right? Reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty and all its dimensions according to national definitions. So there is a recognition that different communities or different states define poverty in different ways, right? That the $1.25 per day is not the only way to think, not the only idea that we can use to understand poverty. Some of the ideas we might consider throughout this presentation is to ask ourselves, is a monetary metric of per capita income really a meaningful indicator of poverty or of sustainability or sustainable livelihoods? And is a quantitative metric of current food production a meaningful indicator of sustainability? So when we talk about hunger, we often talk about production, distribution, how much availability is in the capacity for people to have access to that food. But there's something that's getting lost, I think, in that focus, in those ideas that we use to organize our relationship with the land and with this idea of sustainability. So we could ask ourselves, what cultural tools are needed to effectively address poverty and hunger? And it seems like the cultural tools that we have been using up to this point are not exactly being that successful at achieving these goals, right? So how should we think and act in response to poverty and hunger? These are, I think, the questions I want to explore today. So I don't want to paint too bleak of a picture. Clearly, we are globally having some real success in eliminating extreme poverty. And this graph is not $1.25 a day, it's $1.90 a day. And you can see that between 1990 here and 2015, poverty has been really, at least measured in terms of $1.90 per day. You can see South Asia, that's mainly India, East Asia, mainly China. There has been rapid development in this part of the world. And so as they have entered the global economy, the opportunities to participate in the formal economy have multiplied in this part of the world, and so the opportunities to have money incomes have gone up correspondingly. Now, if we look at hunger, though, the story is not as bright. We can see that in 2005, it had come down in the 1990s. Hunger there was about 1 billion people who were undernourished. It did come down, but now we can see that since 2018, it's starting to go back up. And if you look at the goals for 2030, it's expected to take a rather steep increase. The yellow line is the number of unnourished in millions, and the darker line below is the percentage. So the percentage doesn't go up quite as fast because of population increase. And the wealthy people, our population is increasing more rapidly than the people who are undernourished. So here are the indicators for hunger. And you can see the recognition in some of these indicators that our historical approach to hunger is being questioned. 2.3 talks about, double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, in particular women, indigenous people, family farmers, pastoralists, and fishers, including through secure and equal access to land and other productive resources and inputs. And so, the sort of mainstream approach to hunger is we need big agriculture to, design new and more productive species of plants and put more land under production so that we can extract more food. But these large corporations are partly interested in increasing their market share. They're not necessarily, just like pharmaceutical companies don't seem to be able to cure cancer, the big agricultural corporations haven't necessarily made the best contribution to reducing hunger, I think. The 2.5 talks about the genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants, and farmed and domestic animals, and also related wild species. Agriculture and domestic animals are crowding out the space for wild species, right? We're taking over more and more of the biosphere with our agricultural and livestock production activities. And then there's also the problem of food waste, and how much food do we waste really? Well, it's quite a lot. It's about a third. Although some of it, if a lot of it is wasted at the site of production, that sometimes is because the market conditions are so bad for the producer that they just let the food rot in the field because our economic system doesn't have a mechanism to make it worthwhile for the farmer to harvest it and get it to market. So, but it's important to remember that at least then it goes back into the soil, so it's not a total waste. A lot of agricultural activity is actually exhausting the soil and the productive capacity to grow more crops. So at least if you're putting some organic matter back into the soil, you're supporting some of the living part of the soil, because soil is made of inorganic weathered material, dead organic matter and living organic matter. And that living organic part is really important. 400 million people living on less than $2 a day, and yet we're spending $2 trillion a year on weaponry. Hopefully, it'll never be used, right? Everybody agrees on that. But in the meantime, people are going hungry. We could look at how much we spend on advertising. And these expenditures it's never just, an expense that happens somewhere disconnected from hunger and poverty. They become part of the ecology of mind in the world. Like people become aware that this is how we organize our economy as human beings, right? We spend X amount on advertising, and those advertising expenses use resources. They have an impact, obviously, because if they had no impact, nobody would continue to spend this kind of money. So those advertising dollars favor certain ideas. It's like fertilizer for some kinds of ideas, and turns our attention away from other ideas, other ways of organizing our society and our total ecology of mind, our global ecology of mind. So there are, I just want to emphasize that there are different ways, different ideas that we could use to think about poverty or sustainability. This is a rather old one too, but it was a very influential one. Amartya Sen talked about poverty as an unfreedom, like that really, it's not poverty that's the problem, it's people's incapacity to organize their communities into economic systems that can result in sustainable livelihoods. That if you don't have a little bit of capital to be able to manipulate the world around you into something that can provide you with a livelihood, that's a more meaningful understanding of what poverty is than a monetary metric. Are there any questions so far? I don't want to go too fast. And yeah.
So if poverty going down, how come how does that increase?
Well, most of the poverty is going down in Asia, in China, India, Southeast Asia, where they are doing a lot of manufacturing. And so they have money. They, like China, has invested heavily in land in Brazil to grow soybeans. It's called virtual water. Soybeans take a lot of water to grow, so they grow them in Brazil. They ship them to China where they feed them to pigs, because the wealthier people in China now have developed an appetite for pork. But the people in Brazil whose land they may have been able to, grow their own food on, now is growing soybeans for pigs in China. So in other parts of the world, there's more hunger, even though there's more money and people are being lifted out of poverty. But it's not just a question of, if you have money, obviously you can buy food. I mean, think of the people in Canada's north, right? If you have a food budget of $100 a week in Montreal, you can buy a certain basket of goods, right? In the north, you can only buy a fraction of that with $100 a week, right? So it's partly distribution. There's a lot of reasons, but they're all of that general type, I think. Does that answer your question? Anyone else? Yeah.
The other problem too is that you mentioned, people getting wealthier in South Asia. Statistically, it's been shown that as people get wealthier, they prefer eating, they revert to diets that have more meat as well, and that probably sort of proliferates the type of agriculture that we're doing right now. So we have to have like a shift.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I noticed on that graph that Africa has kind of just been stagnant or wide across. Is there no improvement in
It's getting worse, actually. If you look, yeah, you can see it's slowly rising, actually. Yeah. And part of that, I think, is historical, and it has to do with colonization and the economic structures that were imposed in Africa that were entirely focused on extraction of resources, right? Yeah. So the forests had tremendous value as timber, but when the forest is gone, you know, the people's capacity to feed themselves. I mean, there's a big problem now with bushmeat because people have to eat, right? There's a problem with fishing offshore where the international trawlers have come and, you know, so the traditional ways of people feeding themselves have been destroyed by these kind of extractive industries. Yeah, it's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Anyone else before we move on? So then we have to also think about the ideas that we used to think about what is hunger, because it's not just the people who don't have enough food, but there's also people who rely on the industrial food system who eat over processed food. So we have, you know, probably more people in the world today who are suffering from obesity from an you know, a highly industrialized food system than we have people who are suffering from an inadequacy of food. So we have to think, you know, that maybe our focus is always on one end of the distribution, right? The lack of, but sometimes we have to think about the other side, you know, like maybe there's some people who have too much, and that doesn't go just for food, but it also goes for wealth, because in a system, in a global ecological, economic, psychological system, an ecology of mind, the subjectivities, the kind of ideas that people use when they have too much wealth are also very destructive, and also support other narratives and ideas that are they become very difficult path dependencies and obstacles to be overcome in our quest to achieve sustainability. And we know that people have been saying this for a long time. It's a big open question as to why these discourses or rhetorics fail to resonate in our society. But as Martin Luther King pointed out a long time ago, there are a lot of poor people in some of the richest countries in the world. I'll let you read it. So you know, these kind of extractive practices have been legitimized and supported by government, and you know, it's and I think this is another great point, you know, that billionaires nobody makes $1 billion, right? You know, organize an advantage into structures that, you know, make $1 million from, have somebody else making $1 million for you. So the SDGs don't focus on extreme wealth, but they're probably just as big an obstacle to get to sustainability as extreme poverty. The number of undernourished people in the world continues to rise. And again, the goal of our economic system has been to maximize profits and extract as much profit as possible. That's the general kind of orientation of business and government and universities, and the whole of society is organized around these ideas where we focus on generating wealth through extractive processes. In the meantime, soils are being exhausted. The productive capacity of the earth, we have land, a substantial amount of land every year that's lost to salinization, urban sprawl, desertification, you know. So the over extraction of resources from ecosystems without thinking about what's happening to the productive capacity of that place to support ecosystems that actually include human beings, right? There's a whole research project now that's sort of called One World, One Health, where we're beginning to recognize that we can't have healthy people without healthy ecosystems. So the sort of systematic destruction of the productive capacity of the earth is not a good idea. But we have all of these ideas, you know, the idea of survival of the fittest, of the market knows best. All of these stories that we weave into a conventional wisdom that we need to overcome if we'll ever hope to achieve sustainability and eliminate poverty and hunger. The oceans are running out. Even an increasing percentage of the fish that's being produced now is aquaculture, right? It's fish farms. But in the long run, if the ecosystem of the ocean collapses, the fish farms will also collapse. So I asked you to read this article about these indigenous people off the coast of North Carolina, I think it is, in St. Helena Island. I think what I was hoping you would take from that is to start to recognize this sort of systems view of sustainable development. One of the ideas that they used to organize their relations with the land was this idea that the land is abundant. It wasn't based on an assumption of scarcity. It was based on a kind of a partnership with the land rather than extracting, right? So you can see that ideas matter. The kind of tools that we use to frame our relationship with the world matter. They're important. We tend to think from a Western science perspective that knowledge is neutral and that more knowledge is better than less knowledge. But I think it's time to start to recognize there are good knowledges, good ideas, good frames and metaphors and other tools to organize our relationship with the world, and there are bad ones. There are good ways of thinking, and I think indigenous people have a lot to teach us in this regard. They focused more on narrative forms of knowledge rather than propositional forms of knowledge. A propositional form of knowledge may seem like a neutral knowledge, but when you put that knowledge into the world, it has a kind of agency. You know, you think about survival of the fittest, or these Malthusian kind of ideas about how to deal with poverty or how to justify extreme wealth. They have an impact, right? So we need to be more discriminating in the kind of tools that we take on board to tackle problems like poverty and hunger. And I think you saw the same thing in this article about people's perceptions of basic income in Finland. And we think of these Nordic countries as very progressive and socially minded. But you can see that the ideas that we have in Canada to answer questions like, what is a human being? What are my obligations to my fellow human beings? Were also at play in Finland. And there was a struggle, right, between, should society take care of everyone, or should there be obligations for people to contribute to society also? So there's no easy answers, when you start to focus on the kind of ideas that are getting in the way of achieving these sustainable development goals. But the first step, I think, is to be aware. And so as we go through the rest of the goals, I hope you'll keep in mind this perspective of thinking about the ideas that generated or support the idea of the goal in the first place, and what kind of ideas are either the ones that we need to be able to achieve those goals, or the ones that are acting as obstacles to the achievement of that. And the last article I asked you to look at was the first chapter of a book on forests and food security. And this will bring us back to the talk by Professor Neves. If you think about the island of Montreal and ask yourself, what would be the most productive way of organizing the ecology of the island of Montreal? I think the answer you would find is that it would be a forest ecosystem, right? We have enough rainfall, we have the climate that would normally support forests. And forests can feed people. They have in the past. They wouldn't, if you organized parts of the landscape around here as into agroforestry, it would support, first of all, the diets would change a little bit. There are any kind of vegetable where you eat the leaves or the roots are much more shade tolerant than you think. There would be a lot more maybe nuts and berries in your diet. But I think there's the other aspect of a move away from industrial agriculture and towards agroforestry is the change in the landscape that would support different ideas, different ways of thinking and being in the world. Part of the big challenge we have in terms of sustainability is that we live in landscapes that have been configured into systems that are unsustainable. And those materialities, those built environments, support the ideas and the thinking of unsustainability, right? There's that implicit or tacit aspect of the landscape that supports particular sets of ideas, right? I mean, if you think about this building and what was the logic that supported the extraction of the materials, the bringing them to market, the putting them into the particular configuration of this building? There's a whole, ecology of stories there, right? And because you live in it, it becomes part of the background of all of your perceptual, cognitive, and emotional practices, right? So I think to address poverty and hunger, we have to recognize that now we need to shift those stories towards repairing this unsustainable world. And that's not just ideas, but also the materiality of the world. We need to put it into new systems, new configurations, new assemblages, if you will. And I think this is the last slide that brings us to next week, where we will look at health. So, are any questions or observations or comments or? Yeah.
I think it's more of a comment, you know, that the society that we live in is overindulging. And going back to the article about the gulag, you see that they're very mindful of the land and the resources that they use, right?
Yeah.
Like they capture crab, and they take the claw and they put the crab back. So
Yeah.
the claw can grow back. So, you know, that has to be the type of mentality that, like, society at large adopts if we want to achieve anything in terms of sustainability.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, and I mean, even you can think about the difference between that subjectivity, if you will, and the subjectivity of the student who's competing with his classmates for a better grade. And, you know, maybe it's a stretch to compare the two, but yeah, you're right. I mean, they know which species they don't have to just take the claw from, which ones they, you know, they are intimately aware of what's going on. I mean, and so our system is so long distance now. So we get our, you know, our Caesar salads from California or our almonds. We have no idea what's going on there. You know, if we might see forest fires on the news or read something about water shortages there, but we don't get concerned about, you know, that maybe we won't be able to continue to get our Caesar salads from California. We just assume that the market will produce them somewhere else, right? Yeah, good point. Yes?
And also, I would like to add something on that. We have like a concept of tragedy of the commons. Like, we think that the environment is like, it's like a common, you know, access for us, for all. But there are people that are so greedy that they think that there's a lot of resources that way they are like, they're getting the resources, like all things that they want, without thinking of other people. And the practices of Kulagiji is a good practice. It's a sustainable practice for us to think about that, because they're getting the crab, for example, and then taking back the crab, just getting the claw or whatsoever, like that. They're not only thinking about the other people who are able to access those crops, but also the ecosystem, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a switch from thinking of it as a zero-sum game where, you know, for me to gain something, somebody else has to lose, to thinking of it as we're going to, you know, try to make the world the best we can, because the only way I can have a good world is if we make a good world together. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's the concept of sustainable development, you know, minding the needs of the future generation.
Yeah.
With, I mean, meeting our needs without compromising the needs of other generations.
Yes. Yes.
Just to kind of build on what you just said, like where you were previously talking about how the environment that surrounds you actually like makes the way you think. I think that was really evident with the Goichi traditions. Something that struck me in reading was that I saw something about a man exchanging his construction services for shrimp and oyster. And that's like traditionally what is thought of. self-sustainable. So I think the fact that they don't need to rely on like a system of currency to define their like standing, societal standing, speaks a lot to them as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, brilliant observation. Yeah, absolutely, you're right. Yeah. Yes, very good. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on what you were calling as the obstacles that exist within our conventional wisdom that we need to be overcoming. And you know, when you were comparing how the Wikichi tradition sees abundance in the land that they see, whereas we see scarcity. I think I would argue that in our heritage or cultural tradition, the reason why we see scarcity today is because originally we saw it as abundance, but that abundance that came from, let's say, Christian theology, where the world is seen as something abundant, mixed with the doctrine of rights and entitlement that we have into it. I think I would argue that there are some like almost universally accepted doctrines today, like the doctrine of human rights, that is based on the moral foundation that we have a right to something. And we mix that with the conception that the universe is abundant with our idea that we're entitled to it, and that's why we're in this situation today.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It can be very nuanced. Yeah, I think the aspect of it that I find most puzzling, that is very much part of mainstream economic thought, is that you know, you can, you think about the way a city grows and how you decide what to build in a particular place. It's all based on land values, right? And there's never a question of thinking about the pre-existing ecology of the place. If it's close to the downtown business core and it has a high value, it's not going to be a forest, you know. So the logic that we've kind of internalized in terms of thinking about scarcity or abundance and how it gets formalized in economic frameworks. In a way, you have to look at how those ideas, you know, what what they do, and how they operate today. So yeah, there's a kind of a convoluted history or confluence of different ideas that got us to where we are today, but certainly they're very well entrenched now, and very destructive, I think. Very difficult to see how we're going to move beyond it at this point, at this particular juncture in time. Yeah. Anyone else? All right. Well, let's take then a 5 or 10 minute break, and we'll come back and get organized into our groups for the group project for this course. Sorry, Doug. I should have. I guess I should have ended it more formally. It's okay. I wasn't thinking.